North America in 1492. Over the centuries, the Americans who lived north of Mexico adapted their once similar ways of life to very different climates and terrains, thus creating the diverse cultural areas that the Europeans encountered when they arrived. Scholars often delineate such culture areas by language groups such as Algonquin or Iroquoian, because neighboring indigenous nations commonly spoke languages or related languages. Societies that lived in environments not well suited to agriculture, because of inadequate rainfall or poor soil, for example, followed a nomadic lifestyle. Within the area of the present-day U.S., these groups included the Paiutes, the Shoshones, who inhabited the Great Basin, now Nevada and Utah. Because of the difficulty of finding sufficient food, such hunter-gatherer bands were small, usually composed of one or more related families. The men hunted small animals and women gathered seeds and berries. Where large game was more plentiful and food supply therefore more certain, as in present-day central and western Canada and the Great Plains, bands of hunters were somewhat larger. In more favorable environments, larger indigenous groups combined agriculture with gathering, hunting, and fishing. Those who lived near the seacoast, like the Chinooks of present-day Washington and Oregon, consumed fish and shellfish in addition to growing crops and gathering seeds and berries. Residents of the interior, for example, the Arikaras of the Missouri River Valley, hunted large animals while also cultivating maize, squash, and beans. The peoples of what is now eastern Canada and the northeastern United States also combined hunting, fishing, and agriculture. They used controlled fires both to open land for cultivation and to assist in hunting. Extensive trade routes linked distant peoples. For instance, hoe and spade blades manufactured from stone mined in modern southern Illinois had been found as far as northeast as Lake Erie and as far west as the Plains. Commercial and other interactions among disparate groups speaking different languages were aided by the universally understood symbol of friendship, the calumet, a feathered tobacco pipe offered to strangers at initial encounters. Across the continent, native groups sought alliances and waged war against their enemies when diplomacy failed. Their histories, though not written, were complex and dynamic long before Europeans arrived. Gendered division of labor. Societies that relied primarily on hunting large animals, such as deer and buffalo, assigned that task to men, allotting food preparation and clothing production to women. Before such nomadic bands acquired horses from the Spaniards, women, occasionally assisted by their dogs, also carried the family's belongings whenever the band relocated. Such a sexual division of labor was universal among hunting peoples, regardless of location. Agricultural societies assigned work in divergent ways. The Pueblo peoples, who lived in 60 or 70 autonomous villages and spoke 5 different languages, defined agricultural labor as men's work. In the east, large clusters of people speaking Algonquin, Iroquois, and Muskogean languages allocated most agricultural chores to women, although men cleared the land. French colonizers often commented on native gender roles that were very different from their own. Quote, men leave the arrangement of the household to the women without interfering with them. They cut and decide and give away as they please without making the husband angry. This was noted by Father Paul Lejeune of the Algonquin peoples he missionized along the shores of the St. Lawrence River. In the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, whom French called Iroquois, women held positions of political and cultural authority. This, too, Europeans found striking. Quote, amongst the Huron nations, wrote Father Pierre de Charlevoix, the women name the counselors and often choose persons of their own sex. Indeed, he said, quote, the women have the chief authority among all the nations of the Huron language, excepting the Oneida. In general, he thought they handled this surprising power ably. Everywhere in North America, women cared for young children, while older youths learned adult skills from their same-sex parent. Children had a great deal of freedom. young people commonly chose their own marital partners, and in most societies, couples could easily divorce if they no longer wished to live together. In contrast to the earlier Mississippian cultures, populations in these societies remain at a level sustainable by existing food supplies, largely because of low birth rates. Infants and toddlers nursed until the age of 2 or even longer, and taboos prevented couples from having sexual intercourse during that period. Social organization. The southwestern and eastern agricultural peoples had similar social organizations. They lived in villages, sometimes with 1,000 or more inhabitants. The pueblos resided in multi-story buildings constructed on terraces along the sides of cliffs or other easily defended sites. Northern Iroquois villages, like modern-day New York State, were composed of large rectangular bark-covered structures or longhouses. The name Haudenosaunee means people of the long house. In the present-day southeastern United States, Muskogeans and southern Algonquins lived in large houses made of thatch. Most of the eastern villages were surrounded by wooden palisades and ditches to fend off attackers. In all the agricultural societies, each dwelling housed an extended family defined matrilineally, that is, through a female line of descendants. Mothers, their married daughters, and their daughters' husbands and children all lived together. Matrilineal descent did not imply matriarchy or the wielding of power by women, but rather served as a means of reckoning kinship. Matrilineal lines also linked extended families into clans. The nomadic bands of the prairies and Great Plains, by contrast, were most often related patrilineally, or through the male line. They lacked settled villages and defended themselves from attack primarily by moving to safer locations when necessary. War and politics. The defensive design of native villages points to the significance of warfare in pre-Columbian America. Long before Europeans arrived, residents of the continent fought one another for control of prime hunting and fishing territories, fertile agriculture lands, or sources of essential items such as salt for preserving meat and flint for making knives and arrowheads. Native warriors, protected by wooden armor, battled while standing in ranks facing each other, the better to employ their clubs and throwing spears, which were effective only at close quarters. They began to shoot arrows from behind trees only when they confronted European guns, which rendered their armor useless. People captured in such wars were sometimes enslaved and dishonored by losing their previous names and identities, but slavery was not a primary source of labor in pre-Columbian America. Indigenous political structures varied considerably. Among pueblos, the village council, composed of 10 or 30 men, was the highest political authority. No larger organization connected multiple villages. Nomadic hunters also lacked formal links among separate bands. The Iroquois, by contrast, had an elaborate political hierarchy incorporating villages into nations and nations into a confederation. A council of representatives from each nation made crucial decisions of war and peace for the entire confederacy. In all the Northern American cultures, civil and war leaders divided political power and wielded authority only so long as they retained the confidence of the people. Autocratic rulers held sway only in southeastern chiefdoms descended from the Mississippians. Women more often assumed leadership roles among agricultural peoples, especially those in which females were the primary cultivators. Female sachems or rulers led Algonquin villages in what is now Massachusetts, but women never became heads of hunting bands. Iroquois women did not become chiefs, yet clan matrons exercised political power, including the power to start and stop wars. Religion. The continent's native peoples were polytheistic, worshiping a multitude of gods, sometimes under one chief creator. The major deities of agricultural peoples like the Pueblos and Muskegans were associated with cultivation, and their main festivals centered on planting and harvest. The most important gods of hunters, like those living on the Great Plains, were associated with animals, and their festivals were related to hunting. A wide variety of cultures, comprising more than 10 million people, inhabited America north of Mexico when Europeans arrived. The hierarchical kingdoms of Mesoamerica bore little resemblance to the nomadic hunting societies of the Great Plains or to the agriculturalists of the Northeast and Southwest. The diverse inhabitants of North America spoke well over 1,000 distinct languages. They are Americans only in retrospect, grouped under the name the Europeans assigned to the continent. They did not consider themselves one people, just as the inhabitants of England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands did not imagine themselves as Europeans. Nor did they think of uniting to repel the invaders who washed up on their shores beginning in 1492. African societies. 15th century Africa, like 15th century America, housed a variety of cultures adapted to different terrains and climates. Many of these cultures were of great antiquity. Like the ancient cultures of North America, the diverse peoples of Africa were dynamic and changing, with complex histories of their own. In the north, along the Mediterranean Sea, lived the Berbers, who were Muslim, followers of the Islamic religion founded by the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century CE. On the east coast of Africa, Muslim city-states engaged in far-ranging trade with India, the Moluccas, which is now part of modern Indonesia, and China. In these ports, sustained contact and intermarriage among Arabs and Africans created the Swahili language and culture. Through the East African city-states passed the spice route, the conduit of waterborne commerce between the eastern Mediterranean and East Sea. The rest followed the long land route across Central Asia known as the Silk Road. South of the Mediterranean coast in the African interior lie the Great Saharan and Libyan deserts, vast, nearly waterless expanses crisscrossed by trade routes passing through oases. The introduction of the camel in the 5th century CE made long-distance travel possible, and as Islam expanded after the 9th century, commerce controlled by Muslim merchants helped to spread similar religions and cultural ideas throughout the region. Below the deserts, much of the continent is divided between tropical rainforest and grassy plains. People speaking a variety of languages and pursuing different subsistence strategies lived in a wide belt south of the desert. South of the Gulf of Guinea, the grassy landscape came to be dominated by Bantu-speaking people who left their homeland in modern Nigeria about 2,000 years ago and slowly migrated south and east across the continent. West Africa, Guinea. The inhabitants of West Africa's tropical forest and savanna grasslands supported themselves with fishing, cattle herding, and agriculture for at least 10,000 years before Europeans ever set foot in the 15th century. The northern region of West Africa and Upper Guinea was heavily influenced by the Islamic culture of the Mediterranean. By the 11th century CE, many of the region's inhabitants had become Muslims. Trade via camel caravans between Upper Guinea and the Muslim Mediterranean connected sub-Saharan Africa to Europe and West Asia. Africans sold ivory, gold, and slaves to northern merchants to obtain salt, dates, silk, and cotton cloth. Upper Guinea runs from Cape Verde in the northeast to Cape Palmas in the southwest. The people of its northernmost region, the so-called Rice Coast, which today is present-day Gambia, Senegal, and Guinea, fished and cultivated rice in coastal swamplands. The grain coast to the south was thinly populated and not readily accessible from the sea because it had only one good harbor, which is now modern Freetown, Sierra Leone. Its inhabitants concentrated on farming and raising livestock. In Lower Guinea, south and east of Cape Palmas, most Africans were farmers who practiced traditional religions rather than Islam. Believing that spirits inhabited particular places, they invested those places with special significance. Like the agricultural peoples of the Americas, they developed rituals intended to ensure good harvest. Throughout the region, villages composed of kin groups were linked to hierarchical kingdoms. At the time of initial European contact, decentralized political and social authority characterized the region. Complementary gender roles. In the societies of West Africa, as in those of the Americas, men and women pursued different tasks. In general, both sexes shared agricultural duties. Men also hunted, managed livestock, and did most of the fishing. Women were responsible for childcare, food preparation, manufacture, and trade. They managed the extensive local and regional networks through which families, villages, and small kingdoms exchanged goods. Despite their different economies and the rivalries among states, the people of Lower Guinea had similar social systems organized on the basis of what anthropologists have called the dual sex principle. Each sex handled its own affairs. Male political and religious leaders governed men, and females ruled women. In the Dahomean kingdom, for example, every male had his female counterpart. In the 30 Akan states on the Gold Coast, chiefs inherited their status through the female line, and each male chief had a female assistant who supervised other women. Many West African societies practice polygamy, where one man has several wives, each of whom lived separately with their own children. Thus, few adults lived permanently in marital households, but the dual-sex system ensured that their actions were subject to scrutiny by elders of their own sex. Throughout Guinea, both women and men served as heads of the cults and secret societies that directed the spiritual life of the villages. Young women were initiated into the Sandé cult, young men into the Poro. Neither cult was allowed to reveal its secrets to the opposite sex. Unlike some of their Native American contemporaries, West African women rarely held formal power over men. Slavery in Guinea. Africans, like North Americans' native peoples, created various forms of slavery long before contact with Europeans. Enslavement was sometimes used to punish criminals, but more often slaves were enemy captives or people who voluntarily enslaved themselves or their children to pay debts. West African law recognized both individual and communal land ownership, but men seeking to accumulate wealth needed access to laborers, so wives, children, or slaves, who could work the land. People enslaved for life composed essential elements of the economy. Slaveholders had a right to the products of the men and women they held in bondage, although the degree to which slaves were exploited varied greatly, and slave status did not always descend to the next generation. Some slaves were held as chattel. Others could engage in trade, retaining a portion of their profits, and still others achieved prominent political or military positions. All, however, found it difficult to overcome the social stigma of enslavement and could be traded or sold at the will of their owners. West Africans, then, were agricultural peoples, skilled at tending livestock, hunting, fishing, and manufacturing cloth from plant fibers and animal skins. They were accustomed to a relatively egalitarian relationship between the sexes, especially within the context of religion. Carried as captives to the Americas, they became essential to transplanted European societies that used their labor but had little respect for their cultures.